Imagine this. A phone rings in the middle of the night. The world is asleep. But one call, made in silence, has the power to shake the foundations of global politics. History doesn't always change with armies or loud declarations. Sometimes it changes with a quiet voice on the other end of a late night line. This was not just a call, it was a turning point. A single decision that signaled courage, independence, and defiance. Leaders across the world woke up to a new reality. The balance of power was shifting. Old rules no longer applied. A nation that was once expected to follow had chosen to lead. What makes this moment so powerful is not the noise it created, but the silence it carried. Silence that spoke louder than threats. Silence that forced even the strongest nations to pause and listen. In that pause, the world realized things would never be the same again. This video, you'll discover how one late night decision rewrote the global order. You'll see why silence can be stronger than war. You'll learn how standing firm, even against impossible pressure, earns respect that no negotiation can buy. And most importantly, you'll understand why this story is not just about politics, it's about life itself. Because in your own life, too, there will be moments where one choice made in silence can change everything. Stay with me until the end, and you'll see why this late night call is a lesson for us all. The world was already watching. Eyes from every corner of the globe were fixed on India. Leaders in closed rooms, analysts in think tanks, and even rivals who pretended not to care. Everyone knew something was changing. The late night call was not just an action, it was a declaration. It confirmed what many had suspected but few had dared to say out loud. India was no longer waiting for permission. It was moving on its own terms. For years, whispers had spread across global corridors. Could India rise without bending to pressure? Could it stand firm when the weight of larger powers tried to push it down? That call answered the question. It was bold, it was clear, and it was final. The world realized in that moment that India was not simply reacting, it was leading. Breaking old patterns takes courage. For decades, smaller nations had been forced into a cycle of obedience. They aligned with stronger countries, hoping for protection or favors. It was an unwritten rule of global politics: follow the giants or risk being crushed. Yet history shows that those who break free from patterns create new realities. That is exactly what happened here. India chose differently. Instead of following, it set its own course. Instead of waiting, it acted. The call was symbolic, yes, but it was also practical. It sent a message across continents. India would no longer play the role written for it by others. It would write its own script. The world was not prepared for this. Old powers were comfortable with predictable moves. They relied on pressure tactics, believing that smaller nations would eventually bend. But this time, the pattern broke. And when a pattern breaks, ripples spread. Other nations begin to notice. Other leaders begin to question. If one country can stand tall, why can't they? This shift was not only about politics, it was about dignity. It was about showing that independence is not just a word, but an action. Too many nations had been trapped in silent submission, pretending they had choices while quietly following instructions from stronger allies. But this call shattered that illusion. Every major capital felt it. Washington, Moscow, Beijing, London. Behind closed doors, discussions turned serious. What does this mean for alliances? What does this mean for trade? What does this mean for influence? India's choice had forced even the most powerful to rethink their strategies. And when powerful nations are forced to rethink, the world order begins to shift. The call also carried a deeper signal: confidence, not arrogance, but confidence born from growth, from stability, from vision. India had built strength quietly over the years, economically, technologically, diplomatically, and now with one decision that strength was revealed to the world. It was no longer a rising power waiting for approval. It was a force declaring its presence. Breaking old patterns is never easy. It invites criticism, it attracts resistance, but it also wins respect. And respect is the currency that shapes global relations more than money, more than weapons, more than speeches. By choosing a different path, India earned that respect. Even those who disagreed could not deny it. The late night call was a reminder that history does not belong only to the loudest voices. Sometimes it belongs to those who act when no one expects it. By stepping away from the shadow of bigger powers, India showed the world that a nation's destiny is not written by others. It is written by the choices it dares to make. And in that moment, the world saw a new chapter begin. Not one of dependence, but one of defiance. Not one of silence, but one of power hidden in silence. The bold move had been made. The pattern had been broken. And the eyes of the world could no longer look away. The shock was immediate. World powers had grown used to smaller nations agreeing, bending, or negotiating until they gave in. But this time, India's answer was simple and firm. No. That single word carried more weight than any long speech. It was not wrapped in diplomacy or softened by conditions. It was a straight refusal, and it echoed across every global capital. The refusal was not expected. For decades, the pattern had been predictable. When pressure came from the strongest nations, others gave way. But India's move disrupted that rhythm. It was as if the ground had shifted under the feet of those who thought they controlled the game. Suddenly, the assumption that everyone would follow no longer held true. Shockwaves spread quickly. Diplomats scrambled to understand the decision. Analysts wrote reports overnight, trying to predict the consequences. Leaders picked up phones, wondering if alliances would crumble. The refusal was more than a word. It was a message. India would not be dictated to, not anymore. And in that silence, power shifted. America felt it the most. For years, it had relied on its influence to guide the decisions of others. But this time, the old methods did not work. Pressure, persuasion, promises, none of it mattered. America had to pause and reassess. This was not the India of the past. This was a country confident enough to say no, even when it risked friction with the most powerful nation in the world. That pause was historic. For a moment, the script of global politics froze. America realized that ignoring India was no longer an option. The old view of India as a partner who would quietly follow instructions had vanished. A new reality was forming. India had to be respected, not just courted. Behind closed doors, conversations turned serious. What would this mean for trade deals? What would it mean for military partnerships? Could America afford to push harder, or would that backfire? The refusal had created uncertainty, and in international politics, uncertainty is power. India now held that power. The shock factor also revealed something deeper: the fragility of old systems. For years, alliances had been built on the assumption that the strongest nations could always control outcomes. India's refusal proved otherwise. It showed that courage could outweigh size and that saying no could be more powerful than saying yes. America's dilemma was clear: push too hard and risk losing India's trust. Step back and admit that a new balance was emerging. Either way, the refusal had shifted the terms. India was no longer a country that could be taken for granted. It was a player whose choices could not be ignored. This moment marked a turning point in perception. Allies began to see India differently. Rivals began to respect it more. Even critics had to acknowledge that the refusal was bold, and boldness has a way of inspiring. Smaller nations began to ask themselves if they too could resist pressure. If India could stand tall, why couldn't they? The world of politics is built on signals, and this was a signal too strong to dismiss. A simple refusal had carried across oceans, disrupted strategies, and forced the most powerful nation to rethink. It was not just about one decision, it was about the message that followed. The era of unquestioned dominance was fading. America's pause was more than hesitation. It was recognition that the balance of power had shifted and that the voice of a nation once overlooked could no longer be silenced. The dilemma was not just America's, it was the world's. Everyone now had to adjust to a reality where India's no meant as much as any superpower's command. And in that adjustment, the global order began to change. Europe's realization came slowly, but it came with force. For years, many European nations had viewed India as a vast market, millions of consumers, cheap labor, and an attractive destination for business expansion. It was easy to reduce the relationship to trade and profit, but the late-night call shattered that limited view. Europe suddenly saw that India was not just a marketplace, it was a power shaping the very rules under which trade, politics, and diplomacy operated. The refusal signaled more than independence. It showed Europe that India was willing to take risks to protect its dignity. This was not the behavior of a dependent economy. It was the behavior of a confident nation with a vision for its role in the world. European leaders who once assumed that India would align quietly now understood that they would have to listen if they wanted cooperation. Think tanks across Europe began revising their reports. India could not be described as a developing market anymore. It was a decision maker in global affairs. The call forced diplomats in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and London to treat India as a voice with authority, not just as a trading partner. And with that shift, Europe's strategy toward Asia began to change. India's independent stance created respect. In international politics, respect often carries more weight than deals or promises. By saying no when pressured, India earned Europe's attention in a way that endless negotiations never could. Leaders realized that engaging with India required a different approach, one built on mutual recognition rather than dominance. On the other side of the world, Russia was paying close attention too. For Russia, India's boldness was a welcome sign. The two nations had a history of cooperation, but this move revealed new possibilities. India's refusal to bow to Western pressure aligned perfectly with Russia's vision of a multipolar world. It was proof that the global order was shifting away from single superpower dominance. Russia saw opportunity in India's independence. It was not simply about trade or defense deals. It was about building a partnership based on equality. By standing apart from Western influence, India showed that it could be trusted to act on its own terms. For Russia, this opened doors beyond old Cold War alignments. It meant fresh chances to deepen energy ties, expand military cooperation, and work together on new technologies. More importantly, Russia understood the symbolism. India's stance was a message to other nations. Independence is possible. That message supported Russia's broader narrative of resisting Western dominance. And by welcoming India's position, Russia strengthened its own argument that the world was no longer unipolar. It was multipolar, diverse, and unpredictable. Europe and Russia both saw the same event, but from different angles. Europe saw a rising force it could no longer treat lightly. Russia saw a partner that validated its vision. Together, these realizations added weight to India's decision. It was no longer an isolated act of defiance. It was a ripple spreading across continents, forcing old powers to rethink their strategies. The impact was not only political. Economists in Europe began to calculate how a stronger India would influence global trade patterns. Analysts in Russia considered how cooperation could balance Western sanctions and economic pressures. The late-night call was becoming a case study in how one bold decision could alter equations far beyond the original moment. Europe's realization and Russia's calculations highlighted the same truth. India had stepped onto the world stage as a shaper, not a follower. It was now a country that could create new paths, break old patterns, and influence others simply by standing firm. And once that truth was seen, it could not be unseen. The world had to adjust. Asia's awakening began quietly. Across the region, leaders watched India's move with a mix of surprise and admiration. For many years, Asian nations had walked a delicate line, often bending under the weight of stronger powers. They feared losing trade deals, aid, or security guarantees. But when India stood firm and said no, it lit a spark. It showed that resistance was possible, that courage could rewrite the script. Smaller nations began to think differently. If India could push back without collapsing, then maybe they too had more power than they believed. The call was not just about one country. It was about creating an example. It gave confidence to nations long trapped in cycles of dependency. Courage suddenly seemed contagious. This awakening carried deeper meaning. For decades, Asia had been seen as a region of followers rather than leaders. Bigger powers set the terms, and smaller states were expected to adjust. But India's boldness challenged that idea. It revealed that Asia could define its own path, not just follow the West or bend to the East. The ripple effect began to change conversations in capitals across the continent. In Southeast Asia, leaders started looking at their options differently. In Central Asia, governments saw that independence could win respect. In East Asia, the message was clear: strength is not measured only by military size, but by the courage to make your own choices. India's stand gave Asia a new sense of identity, one that was less about submission and more about sovereignty. At the heart of this awakening was the economic signal. The late-night call was not just a political statement. It carried an even louder message about independence and economics. For too long, nations had tied their decisions to the promises of aid, trade, or loans. But India's refusal showed that economic strength is the shield that protects political freedom. Without it, nations are forced to obey. With it, they can stand tall. This was a turning point. The call reminded everyone that political courage is only possible when backed by financial independence. India had been building that independence quietly through technology, trade, and domestic growth. Now, with one decision, it revealed the result of that work. It proved that a nation's economy is not just about numbers. It is about leverage, about the ability to say no without fear of collapse. The message spread fast. Nations that had relied heavily on foreign powers began reconsidering their policies. Could they diversify their trade? Could they strengthen local industries? Could they protect themselves from being trapped by debt or dependence? India's example urged them to ask these questions, and the answers pointed toward independence. Economic independence became the hidden lesson of the call. It showed that a nation does not need to shout or threaten to gain respect. It needs stability, self-reliance, and vision. With those in place, a simple refusal carries more weight than any speech. The call was a reminder that wealth is not just about luxury, it is about freedom. Asia's awakening and the economic signal were deeply connected. Courage without resources can fade quickly. Resources without courage can be wasted. But together they create transformation. India had shown the balance: build strength quietly, then use it boldly when the world least expects it. The rest of Asia saw that balance and took note. The late night call became more than a political act. It became a blueprint, a lesson that nations, no matter their size, could choose independence if they prepared for it. And with that realization, Asia began to see itself not as a region waiting for instructions, but as a region ready to shape its own future. Technology as a weapon was the hidden force behind the late night call. While the world often measures strength in tanks, missiles, and armies, India reveals something different. Its real power was not only on the battlefield, but in its digital foundation. The refusal carried weight because it came from a nation that had quietly built technological strength in data, digital infrastructure, and innovation. For years, India invested in technology that touched every corner of its society. Digital payments transformed its economy. Satellites mapped its skies and connected its villages. Startups created solutions that rivaled the best in Silicon Valley. This foundation became a shield. When the call was made, it wasn't just a political statement, it was backed by the power of innovation. The world knew that ignoring India's technological rise was no longer possible. Data became the new weapon. In the past, nations fought over land and resources. Today, they fight over information. India's ability to manage, protect, and leverage its data gave it an edge. The refusal signaled to the world that control over digital space mattered as much as control over physical borders. And in that moment, technology proved itself as strong as armies. Innovation added another layer of strength. While other nations were loud about their advancements, India built quietly. Affordable technology reached millions, creating a population that was not just connected but empowered. This wide digital reach meant that India's strength was not only in government hands but in the hands of its people. That collective capability became a force no one could dismiss. The silent strategy amplified this power. Unlike global powers that announced their every move, India advanced with restraint. No loud declarations, no constant threats, just steady progress. This silence was not weakness. It was a strategy. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates influence. Other nations were forced to guess, to wonder, to prepare for possibilities they could not fully predict. Silence also avoided unnecessary confrontation. By not shouting, India denied its rivals the chance to rally against it. The refusal in the late-night call carried shock because it came from silence. If it had been expected, it would have been dismissed. But its quiet strength made the message impossible to ignore. This strategy reflected wisdom. In a world where noise often drowns reason, moving quietly creates clarity. While others wasted energy on constant declarations, India conserved its strength, and when the moment came, it used that strength decisively. The quiet approach became more powerful than the loudest voices. Technology and silence together formed a unique combination. One provided the shield and the weapon. The other provided the timing and the surprise. This is why the call had such a dramatic impact. It was not just the decision, it was the way it was delivered. Quiet, firm, backed by strength that few had truly measured. Other nations noticed this combination. They saw that power in the modern world does not always come with noise. It comes with preparation. It comes with the ability to innovate without seeking attention. It comes with the discipline to speak only when the moment matters most. India's example reminded the world that in strategy, silence is not the absence of action. It is the presence of control. Technology as a weapon paired with a silent strategy created a new model of power. It showed that nations do not need to mimic the loudness of global superpowers to command respect. They can move differently, build differently, and still change the world order. The late night call was proof that true strength is not always visible, but when revealed, it cannot be denied. The blindside moment caught the world off guard. By the time global leaders pieced together what had happened, India had already taken its stand. There was no warning, no long debates, no hints that it was about to shift the balance. The refusal came quietly, but its impact was loud. Leaders who once believed they had control were forced to pause. And in that pause, they realized the ground had already moved beneath them. This was the power of timing. India acted before anyone could prepare a counter. By the time reports reached the desk of presidents and prime ministers, the choice was made. No negotiations, no space to pressure, no chance to undo what was done. That suddenness created shock, but it also created respect. The message was clear. India would not wait for approval. It would decide for itself, and the world would have to adjust. Adjust. They did. In Washington, conversations shifted from demands to damage control. In Brussels, leaders who once treated India as just a market began to rethink their strategies. In Beijing, the move was studied as a new factor in Asia's balance of power. Even in Moscow, it confirmed that India's independence was real, not symbolic. Everywhere, the adjustment was the same. India could no longer be seen as a follower. It was a player rewriting the rules. The blindside moment also revealed how fragile assumptions can be. For decades, stronger nations assumed that pressure would always win. But this call proved that assumption wrong. Once a smaller nation breaks free, the illusion of control disappears. Suddenly, others start questioning why they must obey, and that questioning is dangerous for those who rely on dominance. This is where the universal takeaway begins. Because this story is not just about politics. It is about life itself. When you stand firm, even against the strongest pressure, the world begins to respect you. Respect is not given to those who bend at every demand. It is given to those who know their value and refuse to compromise it. Think of it in personal terms. People will test you. They will push to see how far you can bend. If you give in every time, they will keep pushing. But the moment you say no with confidence, everything changes. The pressure loses its power. The respect begins to grow. The same principle that shifted global politics applies in everyday life. India's stand was a lesson in dignity. It showed that silence, backed by conviction, can defeat even the loudest threats. It showed that courage is contagious, that one refusal can inspire many others to resist. It showed that strength is not about size, but about belief in one's own worth. The universal takeaway is this: when you decide not to compromise your values, you reshape the environment around you. Whether it is a nation standing against global pressure or an individual standing against personal challenges, the result is the same. Others adjust. The world shifts. Respect is earned. The late night call was one nation's moment, but its lesson belongs to everyone. History is full of loud battles and big declarations, but this was different. It was quiet, it was firm, and it changed the order of things. That is the kind of power each person carries too. The power to stand firm, the power to surprise, the power to change everything with one decision. By the time the world realized it, India had already moved forward. By the time those who doubted you realized your strength, you too can already be standing on higher ground. That is the blindside moment. That is the lesson. And it is proof that when you stand firm, the world always finds a way to respect you. India's call was not just one moment. It was a signal that the old rules no longer applied. It marked a rewriting of the global order, a shift from dependence to independence, from following to leading. One late-night decision showed the world that true power is not in noise but in conviction, not in pressure, but in courage. And this is where the lesson reaches you. In life, too, there will be moments when you must choose to stand firm. When you do, you change not just your own path, but the way others see you. Respect comes to those who refuse to compromise their worth. If this message inspired you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Stay with us for more powerful stories and motivational speeches that remind you one bold choice can change everything.